Hello, this is Albert Einstein. History myths fly around at the speed of light. Especially with that new internet thing you all seem to have. Thank goodness I have a direct connection to Professor Buzzkill, a fellow deep thinker who busts myths and takes names. I'm totally stoked. There's a new episode. I was stuck on this new equation anyway. E equals mc something. Something.
All right, yes, here we are on Professor Buzzkill, and we are once again with another fantastic professor from Penn State, Professor Craig Hammond, who's going to talk to us about the nature of slavery in the United States before the Civil War. Professor, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Thank you very, very much for coming on the show. You know, one of the things that Buzzkillers often ask me, or our listeners often ask me, or often ask us is, what was slavery really like? Were there some nice slave owners? Were all slave owners bad? Was it all whipping? Was it all torture? And so that's why I contacted you to find out about doing this show, because I knew that you give good lectures about this during your American history classes. So can we talk about the nature of slavery before the Civil War?
Sure, and that's a great question. It's a question my students frequently have, which is, were some slave owners kind? Were some slaveholders cruel? What was slavery like for slaves? And while I think it's a great question, in many ways it's beside the point.
Okay.
So the question wasn't whether or not slavery was good for some individuals or whether it was mean and cruel for other individuals.
Yeah.
If you're going to take people and make them slaves, you need violence. You need lots and lots of violence to keep a lot of people enslaved, really to make a whole slave society.
Now, this is very interesting because one tends to think, or I think a lot of the sort of general conception in the culture is that slaves, if they're born on the plantation, but even the ones who brought to the plantation they sort of give up and they think, well, it's just going to be like this. I'll settle in. And their discipline is able to be maintained that way, sort of maintain a continuity. But that wasn't the case at all.
No, not often, no. Some slaves realized that they were going to be slaves, presumably for life, but slave owners constantly had to work hard to keep slaves in slavery.
Okay, leaving aside for a minute the transporting the slaves originally from Africa to the North American colonies, maybe we'll get to that in another show, and getting them selling them at the auction block and getting them to the various plantations. How do then, as you say, keep slaves in slavery?
Well, the key was violence.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of violence.
Now, see, this is very surprising because most people think, as again, I said, it was sort of gentle. It was a gentle situation once it calmed down.
Yeah, and it's funny. There was a book written by a couple of professors back in the 1970s, and they went through plantation records and they counted how many lashes were given to how many slaves over the course of the year.
Yeah.
And what they found out was that it was something like, on average, only 2 lashes, so a slave getting whipped per slave per year, was distributed on most plantations in the Deep South. But again, that kind of misses the point by counting the number of lashes given to a slave per year or something like that.
Right. What are some of the Let's take some of the extremes. Lashes are bad. Of course, everything we're talking about is really, really bad. It's just a question of how bad does it get? What's the extreme end of slavery? If we think of lashes as the soft end of violence, if you will.
Well, whenever the violence was used against slaves, it was never done in private. So if a slave was going to be punished, that slave would never be punished in a barn away from the other slaves or something like that.
Right, which is what we often see in movies. They're taken to the barn, they're stripped to the waist, and they're flogged or lashed by whips. Yeah,
so there's that great scene in the movie Django Unchained, actually, where towards the end, towards the end when Django is captured, and before they're going to sell him away, they're going to castrate Django, and they take Django into the barn away from the prying eyes of the plantation. In fact, it would have been done the complete opposite way. In reality, every slave on that plantation would be witness to Django being castrated for that punishment.
Wow. And so they're actually doing it in front of all the other slaves? And do they do it in a sort of theater situation, or are they just out in the open where everyone can see? Obviously I'm not meaning theater, but do they get the slaves to gather around to see punishment being meted out?
They do, and there's another great scene that your listeners might be familiar with, and that's from either the 1977 miniseries Roots Or from the remake in 2016 starring Forrest Whitaker, when there's that great scene, a very telling scene, where there's a slave by the name of Kunta Kinte, and the slave owner wants to turn him into Toby.
That's right.
And Kunta Kinte refuses to become Toby. He refuses to become this slave for that owner.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is Kunta Kinte runs away. He's captured. He's returned to the plantation. And when he's returned to the plantation, he's very publicly flogged. He's very publicly whipped in front of every slave on that plantation.
That's an amazing thing that a movie or a miniseries has gotten something right. We on this show, we complain about movies all the time, but that's a very important aspect of slavery, and they got that part right anyway.
Very much so. And when slave owners use violence against their slaves, again, it's always done in an incredibly public manner. The point of that violence is to force other slaves to not run away in the future, to force other slaves to be subordinate or to be obedient in the future.
And there must be a whole question of manhood and succumbing to that kind of humiliating punishment in front of the other slaves.
And what you see often is the language of subordination and insubordination.
Yeah.
And for slave owners, for their overseers and the like, it's often a question of forcing male slaves to submit, forcing them to submit to their authority. And it's incredibly gendered language that's often used by slave owners, by their overseers and the like.
Sure.
About forcing their male slaves to submit to their authority. It's quite telling, the language that they use in their letters and the like.
And presumably that the children see this as well.
Sure, and it's one way that children are socialized. Children on plantations, one way that they're socialized into slavery is by bearing witness to this, really what are copious amounts of violence, and violence that's done in such a way, such a public way, that it ends up operating as a form of terror. I don't think it's a stretch to call it really a form of terrorism that's inflicted against African Americans on plantations.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. You say in the lecture you give on this subject and things you've written about this, that the violence can happen in more or less two different ways. It can happen in public or it can happen in private. And when it's done in public and when it's done to this degree in public, it is terrorism.
I think in many ways, and there's just, as historians, we have not hundreds, we have literally thousands of examples of punishment being meted out to slaves in very public ways. I can just mention a few of them if you want to hear about them.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Well, that's what our listeners don't want to hear about terrorism on other human beings, but we do like to hear examples and specifics.
So I'll tell you the story about in the 1710s in Virginia. There's authorities in Virginia who suspect that slaves are plotting a rebellion. Mm-hmm. So they go out, they begin interrogating slaves. And by interrogating slaves, really what they're doing is they're torturing slaves.
Yeah.
And they torture slaves until those slaves give up the details of the rebellion that's being plotted about by slaves.
Okay, so this is a rebellion that hasn't happened yet. This is a rebellion that's being planned, and they're trying to nip it in the bud, and they actually terrorize slaves in order to get the info.
That's correct. And we probably want to do a later show on this about rebellion. But for historians, it's very difficult for historians to tell, even when slaves are actually planning a rebellion.
Yeah.
It's difficult to discern the differences between paranoid white people who fear slave rebellion and whether or not slaves themselves are actually plotting a rebellion.
Yeah, because the slaves are trying to keep it secret.
Slaves are trying to keep it secret, and slave owners suspect something is happening. So they end up torturing slaves. And again, whether or not these three slaves in Virginia in the 1710s were actually plotting a rebellion, authorities were convinced they were.
Do we know at any point, do we have any kind of numbers about how many slaves were rounded up and tortured in order to try to get information in this case?
So in this particular case, 2 or 3 slaves are interrogated. And those 2 or 3 slaves give up the names of Angola Peter, Scipio, and Salvador. And the authorities become convinced that Angola Peter, Silvio, and Salvador are plotting a rebellion.
Right.
So once they're convinced of that, they begin interrogating those 3 slaves and torturing them.
Yeah.
And whether or not, again, those slaves were actually planning a rebellion, as we know how from the war on terrorism, how ineffective torture as a form of interrogation is.
Exactly, yeah.
What ends up happening is those slaves give up the details of the rebellion, whether or not that rebellion was real or not.
Yeah, they'll say anything to stop the torture.
They'll say anything to stop the torture.
Yeah.
So the slaves are convicted. They admit to plotting a rebellion. They're convicted by the authorities. One of the slaves manages to run away, and we'll talk about him in a moment, Angola Peter. But the other two slaves, Salvador and Scipio, their punishment is they're going to be publicly hanged.
Right.
So when they're hanged, when you do a hanging again, it's not done on private in the plantation.
Yeah.
Instead, hanging is done on court day.
Oh, so this is even more public than doing it in front of the other slaves on the plantation. This is bringing them into town.
So this isn't punishment that's being done on an individual plantation. This is punishment that's being done on a countywide scale.
Okay, so this is organized.
This is very organized, and it's organized by the authorities. This is how they keep slaves in slavery. It's going to be court day, so that means that just about every person in that county is going to be there. There's going to be a very large number of slaves will be in town for court day. Now,
is court day something just for slaves to be punished, or are there other cases being tried? Of an I wasn't going to say normal nature. Somebody suing somebody else, or someone is being brought before the authorities for some reason who's not a slave. Is it just your?
It's both. It's all of those things.
But in other words, that just increases the number of people who are going to witness this.
That's correct. And the idea, again, is to have as many people as possible witnessing this. So the punishment that's going to be delivered to Scipio and Salvador is, first of all, they're going to be hanged. And again, they're going to be hanged publicly.
Yeah.
And then once they're hanged, once they are dead, they're decapitated, so their head is cut off.
Yes, this is when I was reading your work on this. It's very, very graphic, and their own descriptions are very graphic and just disturbing.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that too. But slave owners recognize they need to use massive amounts of violence if they want to keep slaves in slavery and prevent slave rebellions.
Yes, in fact, you talk about a planter named William Byrd II who said that in order to keep slaves in subordinate state, quote, foul means must do what fair will not. And what struck me about that quotation was must do. He didn't say we could try them. He said they absolutely must do.
Yeah, if the white authorities had their way, every slave would be a good slave. They wouldn't plot rebellions. They wouldn't run away and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But white authorities, white slave owners recognize that's not the case. And they have a very realistic understanding that they have to use, again, just massive amounts of violence to keep slaves in slavery. And Salvador and Scipio are great examples of this. Salvador and Scipio, after they're hanged and they end up dying, they're decapitated, and then their bodies are drawn and quartered.
Okay, but we need to explain to the Buzzkills actually what drawing and quartering means. Most people have, some people know, but not everyone.
Yeah, it's a particularly gruesome abuse of a corpse is what it is. When a individual, in this case a corpse, is drawn and quartered, what you typically do is you tie ropes around the ankles and around the wrists of the corpse. Then those ropes are tied to 4 horses. So you have 4 horses pointing in 4 different directions.
Yeah.
And those 4 horses are then whipped or hit. They run off in 4 directions. And in doing that, they take the body of the slave who has been hanged, and the body is literally drawn and quartered. It's broken into 4 pieces.
That must be, and to be there to see it on the site as it's happening must be just gruesome, almost beyond belief.
Absolutely, and this is done. The decapitation and the drawn and quartering is done because it's gruesome, because it is a form of terror.
Yeah.
But planners also recognize that many African American slaves believe that when they die, if their body remains intact, their spirit, their soul will return to Africa.
That's right.
But if their body's dismembered, that will be their state in the afterlife as a dismembered body.
Now, I've seen illustrations or pictures, or I don't want to say political cartoons because that's a sort of offensive way to describe it, of these hangings of slaves and whipping of slaves and that sort of thing. Does this mean there's sort of a third level of promotion of the violence or at least promotion of the threat of violence? Then not only are we going to do this on the plantation in front of all the other slaves, we might do it on court day, and there might be engravings made of the hanging, and that might be distributed statewide. Absolutely. So you have engravings that are in books. You have engravings of these gruesome forms of torture that are all over the society. And in many ways, this violence and this terror, it's embedded in the landscape of slave societies. Okay, what do you mean by embedded in the landscape? That's a fascinating term. So Salvador and Scipio, they're beheaded, they're decapitated, they have their bodies drawn and quartered. And what typically happens after a slave
has that done to him or her is the body parts. What's done with the body parts is something called polling. They're polled.
Right.
So this is a verb that's used in the South. It's a verb that comes up after polled.
Yeah.
And what polling means is you go to one of the main crossroads in town, or I'm sorry, in the county, find those main crossroads. And at those main crossroads, one part of the body, whether it be the head, whether it be the extremities, is then placed on a pole, at the top of a pole. And that body part is left there to rot. Birds pick at it, animals rip at it and peck at it and the like. And any slave who walks down the road is constantly reminded of the consequences of the penalty for even thinking about rebelling or thinking about a mass breakout or a mass runaway. That what's going to end up happening to you is, as likely as not, you're going to end up hanged and your head's going to end up on a pole somewhere on the main crossroads in town.
And of course, the main crossroads means an awful lot of white people see it as well. So over the years, it's going to inculcate in everybody this sort of understanding that this is what happens to slaves. This is the way we treat slaves.
Yeah, and again, the way it becomes part of the landscape is this actually isn't all that common in slave societies. But there's the one example I use with students is there's a road that's called Negro Head Run.
Right.
And a run typically means that it's a stream or it's a creek. And because that stream or creek runs through a valley, that's the run, and the road goes next to it because it's a good place to put a road in the floodplain for all intents and purposes.
And by the way, Buzzkill, is when Professor Hammond says Negro Head Run, it's spelled Negrohead, Negro Head. There's no mistaking what's meant here.
Yeah, it's Negro Head Run, and Negro Head Run is where in this one particular county, slaves who are executed and then decapitated, their heads are literally put on the top of poles. And this is the main road in town. It's the main road in the county. It's the main road through the county. But if you move about the county at all, you're going to go ahead and you're going to encounter literally the heads of decapitated slaves on the tops of poles. And that's violence. Yeah. That's violence that's being deployed in such a way that it amounts to terror is what it is.
Right, okay.
And you don't need to do that every day to every slave to keep slaves in slavery. If you do that once a year, once a year everybody witnesses that, that's reminder enough for slaves about the consequences of rebelling.
By the way, we should remind the Buzzkillers where we are chronologically. What in this sort of thing, are we still in the 1710s, 1720s, or is this happening more in the going towards the mid-century?
Well, this happens throughout the 1700s in places like Virginia and in places like North and South Carolina. And in many ways, this happens. These particular examples are coming from Virginia in the 1710s through the 1750s. But wherever you have slavery on a large scale, so whenever you have a slave society where anywhere more than, say, 20% of the population is marked off as being racially distinct, marked off as being black, and held as slaves, wherever you have that, you're going to have these kinds of violence. You can't have slavery without violence.
No, and again, as you say, there's sort of three levels of how it's publicized: whippings on the plantation, the beheadings and mutilating the body in town, and then these engravings that go out everywhere. I just wonder, is there anyone who complains? Is there any part of white society that says, "Look, we understand that these slaves have to be punished, but this is too gruesome."
Not really.
I don't want Lady so and so to see beheaded, decapitated heads as we're driving to the market.
In the southern colonies, you have some people who object to slavery on principle. The Quakers are a great example of that. But even then, it's surprising, in a slave society, in a place like Virginia, that Quakers, who are undoubtedly among the nicest people in the world. Quakers believe that everybody carries a piece of God inside of him or her. There are Quakers in colonial Virginia who acquiesce, who end up purchasing slaves, who participate in this kind of violence.
Right.
If there are objectors, what ends up happening with those objectors is in many cases they end up leaving.
That's interesting because Quakers, in the sort of Atlantic world sense, initially are involved in slavery in the 1600s, then start to push for the abolition of the slave trade in Britain and then the emancipation of slaves. So they're kind of redeeming themselves, but then some of them anyway in the New World are lapsing back into it.
Yeah, and the reality is, if you want to be somebody who's a prominent or even just a moderately prosperous middle-class person in colonial Virginia, the main route, if not the only route to doing that, is by being a slaveholder.
Because the plantation economy is the economy, essentially.
Yes, and I talk with my students about this, that, if you look at slaveholders and planters, why do they become slaveholders and planters? If you're moderately ambitious, you don't go to college and become an engineer in Virginia in the 1720s. If you're moderately ambitious, you end up somehow or another acquiring a plantation and becoming a slave owner.
Sure.
It's sad, but that's the reality of slavery and slave societies in the southern colonies in colonial America.
Okay, a little earlier, I quoted one of the slave owners, Robert Byrd II, who talked about how foul means must do and fair will not. In other words, he's sort of justifying torture because it has to happen. But is that sort of, Buzzkills will get the impression that's typical of slave owners. That conception of what has to happen is typical of slave owners. Can we talk about a few more slave owners so that we know what they're thinking?
Certainly. And I actually want to say more about Robert Byrd II.
Oh, yeah.
When we have in our mind this image of slaveholders, we have in our mind kind of these decrepit, ugly people doing ugly things to slaves. And that's, in many ways, that's certainly the case. But if you take a look at Robert Byrd II, Robert Byrd II is an incredibly worldly, cosmopolitan, highly educated, deeply religious man.
Again, this is Virginia.
This is in Virginia from the 1720s through the 1740s. Robert Byrd II, his father sends him to London for his education.
Oh, right.
He's educated in law at the Middle Temple, which is the most prestigious law school
can't get any higher than
in the entire British Empire.
Right.
He's devout. He's very devout in his religious practices. When you read his diary, and I encourage your listeners to go out and get your hands on The Secret Diaries of William Byrd II.
Oh, right.
When you read his diaries, he spends every morning in prayer. He spends every evening in prayer. When he wakes up in the morning, he typically spends an hour or two reading, writing, and translating in Greek, in Hebrew, in Latin. He's a very urbane man. He's a very cosmopolitan man. He's a very distinguished man. He's a very holy man as far as he is concerned. But he also recognizes that if he's going to keep slaves in slavery, he must use violence.
Sure.
And as far as he's concerned, God has placed him on this earth to govern those people who are beneath them.
Now, he was born in Virginia. He grew up in Virginia. Apart from his time in London, he's more or less been totally absorbed by the slave culture, by the culture of the slave society.
He actually ends up spending a considerable amount of time in London, but he returns. He's born in Virginia, goes to London, spends about a decade in London, comes back to Virginia, and very quickly reabsorbs the role of a planter, the role of a patriarch in Virginia. And as far as he's concerned, he's from a very distinguished Virginia family, but as far as he's concerned, God has placed him on this earth to govern the people who are beneath him, those people being his slaves, but also others.
And that same attitude, God has placed me on this earth to govern people who are beneath me, must have been also shared by a lot of these other major slave owners.
Absolutely. And not only do people like Robert King Carter, his nickname's King, his name kind of exhibits that, not only to believe that they were placed on this earth to govern those who were beneath them, but they also believe that everybody else on this earth was placed on earth by God to obey them. So why did God put slaves on earth? And if you asked William Byrd II that question somehow or another, his answer would probably be that God put slaves on this earth to be obedient to me. If you asked Robert Carter the same thing, why did God put slaves on this earth? Why did he put Africans on this earth? His answer would probably be that God put these people on this earth to be obedient to me.
So they don't even question the origins of slavery from way back when, probably because they've read the Old Testament, which is rife with slavery, and they don't even think about, why is this system here? It's just second nature.
Yeah, and beyond that too, Robert Byrd II, that great line that you read there from him, foul means must do, what fair will not. Robert Byrd II sincerely wants to be a good, kind slave owner. He believes that it's his obligation to govern people who are incapable of governing themselves.
Right. Okay.
And their only job is to obey him.
Right.
But if they don't obey him, they're committing an offense, first of all, against Robert Byrd II.
Yeah.
But equally important, they're committing an offense against God himself.
Wow.
And as far as Robert Byrd II is concerned, it's his job to use violence, to use all kinds of terror and torture to punish slaves when they don't obey them.
Well, so he's really taking it up the hierarchy. If you go up to God himself, then you are really solidifying the justification for this society.
Yeah, and William Byrd II has a letter in 1727 that he writes to a friend back in London where he says, I'm like one of the patriarchs of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And who are the patriarchs of the Bible? Moses is one of them.
Yeah.
In the cosmic hierarchy of the Old Testament, who's above Moses?
Yeah, no.
Well, it's God. So you have Moses who has a direct line to God. And as Byrd II writes, he writes, I'm like one of the patriarchs of the Bible. It's God, and then it's William Byrd II. He says he has his flocks that he has to tend to. It's his job to keep these people, his people, it's a term that he repeatedly uses.
Sure.
It's his job to keep his people in their place.
Okay, Buzzkillers, well, there are plenty of other slave owners like this, but this is a good time, since we're about 20 minutes in, for us to take a quick break for station identification. And we'll be back in a moment with Professor Hammond.
This is Mary Todd Lincoln. President Lincoln is indisposed at the moment, but he asked me to remind you that Professor Buzzkill is part of Entertainment One's podcast network and is available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Please subscribe and leave him a review. Please also go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com to support him on Patreon, to subscribe to his email notifications, and to shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. Follow him on Facebook, on Twitter at BuzzkillProf, and on Instagram at Professor Buzzkill. Thanks for listening.
Okay, we're back with Professor Hammond talking about the nature of slavery before the Civil War, but also about what's going on inside some slave owners' heads. We're still in the 1700s. We talked about Robert Byrd II. Someone might think, well, he's an isolated case out in the provinces somewhere in Virginia. Is the Virginia government doing anything like this or sanctioning this or anything like that?
Yeah, so we have to remember that if you go to any of the slave states or any of the slave colonies, they're governed by slave owners themselves.
Right.
So it's the slave owners who write the laws that govern relationships between slave owners and slaves themselves. So in 1705, what Virginia ends up doing is they codify the list of laws that they've passed over the previous half century. So the slave owners sit down and they put together all the laws governing slavery.
And what is this law called?
It's the 1705 Virginia Act Concerning Servants and Slaves.
Okay, we have a good quote from this act that illustrates what Professor Hammond is talking about. It's going to be read by one of the voice actors from the Buzzkill Institute.
And if any slave resist his master, or owner, or other person, by his or her order, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, it shall not be accounted felony, but the master, owner, and every such other person so giving correction shall be free and acquit of all punishment and accusation for the same, as if such accident had never happened.
Okay, Professor, that was very, very, very specific, and it tells us exactly what happens if a slave dies while being punished.
Yeah, so this law lays out the rules by which slaves can be punished.
Yeah.
And what it says is that if a slave is murdered in the course of being corrected, in the course of being punished, well, if I beat Professor Buzzkill to death, I'm going to be charged with murder.
Yeah.
But what the
because
Virginia
Professor
law,
Buzzkill's a free man, right?
Because he's a free man. But what the 1705 Virginia law says is that if a planter or if his agent beats a slave to death in the course of correcting that slave, in the course of punishing that slave, it's not a felony. It's not murder.
That's amazing. So this really is property.
It is. Well, it's more than property, but what it says there, it says is that it's the slave who is responsible for his or her own death.
And I wonder whether that's why they use the term correction so often in this passage, and presumably in other laws similar. We're correcting the slave. They say punishment and other things like that, but correcting such a slave, if it happens to be killed in such a correction, It seems as if it's you're scolding a schoolboy, but of course you're doing it at extreme levels.
And that's how people like Robert Byrd II see it. It is their job.
Learning, yeah.
When they punish slaves, when they correct slaves, they're not doing it because they're sadistic. They're not doing it because they're masochists. They're doing it because they have an obligation before God to put the people beneath them in their place and to force those people to be obedient.
Well, why don't we talk about a couple more examples of slave owners like this?
Yeah, and in many ways, it's very patriarchal and it's very hierarchical.
Mm-hmm. The society,
and you can see how this works in just a few cases here. In 1745, there's a slave woman by the name of Eve who is responsible for serving the slave owner breakfast every morning. He ends up falling sick and he ends up dying.
Right.
Eve is accused of poisoning his milk, of murdering him.
Yeah.
And again, as historians, we can't tell whether or not Eve actually did this.
No, yeah.
But nonetheless, white authorities are convinced that Eve has poisoned her master's milk. And that's a quote there, that she, quote, poisoned her master's milk. And he ends up dying as a result of that.
So then what happens to Eve?
So what happens to Eve is sentenced to be burned alive at the stake.
Oh, my God. I mean, obviously, all these things are bad and horrible, and especially when a slave is killed. But to be burned alive at the stake is really taking it to an extreme level in terms of display.
Yeah, and we have to understand how slave owners understand this alleged crime by Eve. It's not just that she murdered somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what Eve did was she committed an act of violence against the hierarchy, against the social order that has been established by God himself.
Right, and possibly because she did it in this, again, we don't know whether she actually did this, but did it she could have done it in a sneaky way, poisoning rather than open rebellion.
Yes, because it was sinister, because it was in the secret like that. It was considered to be a particularly egregious crime. And it wasn't, again, just a crime against a person. Instead, it was a crime against this entire hierarchy, this entire order that has been created by God himself.
Eve was burned alive at the stake. That's another sort of very public punishment. What other sorts of things happened?
Well, in 1737, a slave named Peter kills his owner, John Riddle. So Peter was hanged, and the sheriff, quote, this is a quote from the Virginia records, from the court records.
Yeah.
The sheriff, quote, cut off his head and put it on a pole near the courthouse to deter others from doing the like.
Oh, okay. This is, again, we get back to what we talked about before the break, the polling of body parts, and this description of deterring others from doing the like is a perfect way of expressing what they're trying to do.
Yeah, slave owners and white authorities in Virginia are perfectly frank about what they're trying to do when they're using these massive amounts of violence that, again, I think can only be construed as a form of terror.
Yeah.
Why else would you? It's not just that he's punished. It's not just that he's hanged. It's that his head is cut off, and then his head is then put on top of a pole.
Right.
And it explicitly says in the court records that this is done to deter others from doing the like, to deter others from doing the same.
Well, sadly, tragically, Buzzkillers, there are lots and lots of these examples, and we could go on and on and on giving the examples. But I think what most of you would be interested in knowing is, how does this sort of violence, terrorism, punishment, correction fit into what we call a slave society? How does it help make it a slave society, or enhance its stability as a slave society, or its progress as a slave society?
Yeah, if you're going to have a slave society, and we can think of a slave society as being any kind of society where anywhere between, say, 20% and 80% of the population is racially distinct, in this case marked off as black, whatever that might mean, and enslaved. If you're going to have a slave society, you must use massive amounts of violence and terror. As my students typically ask me at the beginning of the semester, were some slaveholders kind? Were some slaveholders cruel? And as I said at the beginning of what we're doing here today, it's in many ways beside the point.
Yeah.
If you have slave owners, or if you have a society that's kind, or better yet, just not cruel and not using terror or violence against slaves, you're not going to have a slave society for very long.
No. If
you're a slave owner who is nice and who is kind, you won't be a slave owner for very long, because your slaves will run away from you.
Yeah, I think that there's an incorrect notion out there that kind and family-oriented slave owners were not only kind because they were, quote, good people, but also because that was a way to keep slaves on the plantation, that they were having a, quote, nice life, when in reality, the nature of their work means they're not having a nice life. And so in order to keep them doing that sort of work, they have to be treated in this way.
Yeah, it's you cannot have slavery without having violence. It's at the core of it.
Yeah. From the capture all the way to, well, eventually emancipation.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this in subsequent episodes, but once you get to Revolutionary America and you have slaveholders such as George Washington, slave owners such as Thomas Jefferson, they are men of the Enlightenment. They do not want to use violence.
Right.
And they find out they have a very hard time keeping their slaves in slavery without the use of violence.
That's an interesting topic on its own.
Yeah, they don't personally use violence against their slaves. They have others who do it.
Right, but
it's not just violence that's used against slaves, although it is.
Yeah.
What's often used for slaves who don't obey, slaves who aren't quote-unquote good slaves, is either they will be sold away, so they'll be sold away from their friends and their family, or they'll have family members who are sold away.
Well, it only remains for me to thank Professor Hammond for being here on the show, so thank you, Professor.
Thanks for having me here. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak about such an important topic.
Yeah, it is a very, very, very important. And Buzzkillers, please look on the Buzzkill bookshelf. We've put important readings there that you can get, and we'll talk to you next week.